Native American mythology is diverse and breathtaking. Each tribe has such fascinating and often beautiful folklore. But with the joyful and captivating mythology comes darker and often terrifying myths. Even to this day, some of these myths become real. From supernatural spirits and monsters to prolific killers you wish you never met, today's episode features a number of terrifying tales that happened on reservations. Be warned, one of the following stories is not true. So tell me in the comments which of these stories you think is the fictional creepypasta, if you can guess. And on the next set of themed stories I upload, I'll tell you the answer. Also, let me know if you want more Guess the Creepypasta episodes like this. Enjoy the stories, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. And if you want to listen to my narrations hands-free, follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes. And if you can, please leave a review on iTunes too. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Curse of the Desert Draggers, from Burning Sands. We called them draggers. It's a legend passed down from generation to generation on my reservation. And yet, almost all the people on our reservation today have never heard of the legend. Only a few remaining families still tell the story to their children and their children's children. To be honest with you, it's a story even I nearly forgot. Having been told by my grandmother as a small child, I hadn't heard the story told again until I went searching for it in my late 30s, after experiencing the most horrific moment of my life. There exists a few miles of desert in one direction of our reservation. As the story goes, the people of my tribe roamed these parts far and wide for centuries. They knew to never wander the desert, as the dreadful heat of the day and the polar cold of the night would likely be your end. But there was another threat that often exited that desert, but always returned, dragging one of the tribe into the dunes. Coyotes. Modern coyotes are so docile that even though I was young and impressionable at the time when I first heard the story, I immediately refused to believe that coyotes of all things would be as aggressive as the story portrayed. And yet the legend goes that coyotes would stalk the village at night, looking for unattended children or infants to grab and drag away, whilst the coyote's companions would growl or attack or distract the family members that attempted to stop the dragger coyote. That is why they called them the draggers. These starved and desperate coyotes dragged infants into the desert, where they were never seen again, and often those who followed in an impassioned attempt to rescue their loved ones would also become lost to the extreme temperatures of the dunes. Believe the legend or don't, that's up to you. It is simply the tragic and terrifying story that my family continues to share to this day. As kids, my cousins and I thought the story nothing more than a cautionary tale, an attempt to keep us from wandering around at night and to keep us from exploring that desert. It's funny how a place so obviously dangerous and treacherous is somehow tempting to a child. There were times in my youth where we would ignore the warnings, and we would adventure into the dunes after nightfall. Usually we would hear the howls of coyotes and turn back, reminded of the story of the draggers. But on one brave occasion in which we went a bit too far, we stumbled upon coyote tracks and ran back laughing at our bravery or stupidity. Now, growing up usually brings with it wisdom and experience, but that is not always the case. After all, it was my sober decision to set out into the dunes myself for a camping trip, to be alone with myself after a particularly rough year at work. I had a few days of vacation to use, and I used it to return to nature. The legend of the Draggers was but a distant memory at that point. Even if the legend had been recalled randomly in my head, I wouldn't be able to recall much detail about it. Coyotes or something, I probably would have said. Memory is a fragile thing as the years go by, frustratingly so. I set out on a clear Thursday afternoon. I paid close attention to the weather forecast for the area. I wanted clear weather and moderate temperatures if I could help it. Any foul weather in a place of extreme temperatures would force my outing to an early end, I was afraid. Luckily, it was supposed to be clear. I settled in an area that wasn't too far from a frequented dirt road. That road wouldn't be more than a mile out, if I recall correctly. That particular spot would also make remembering the direction of the road simple, due to the shape of the dunes around me. The plan was not to sleep on the sand. Rather, I'd set up my Jeep with a snug little covered sleeping area in the back. It was a 4x4 with nearly new tires, so traversing the dunes would not be a problem either. Well, I spent the remainder of the daylight reading from my Amazon Kindle, listening to the wind blow through the sandy mounds. When the sun began to dip, I built a fire from the logs I'd brought along. Dinner was deer steak that my mother always cooked so well, fried squash, and some beef franks that I roasted on a stick. Sounds like a lot of meat, but I would not go camping without having a camping snack. But maybe I should have brought marshmallows. As night approached, it was a far more refreshing trip than I even expected it to be. When the day got too hot, the night came along to cool it down. And when I got too cold, I'd just sit a little bit closer to the fire. That night, the desert seemed to be the least dangerous place I'd ever been. Crossing a street in town would be infinitely more risky than this, I thought to myself, thinking back on all the warnings my family had given me as a child over the years. On the other hand, it still made sense. After all, I wouldn't allow my own child to explore the desert on their own. Perhaps growing up into a more understanding and skillful adult had allowed me to enjoy and respect the desert more. I lay back on the sand near the precarious fire pit. I closed my eyes for a while. I wasn't tired yet. I was just thinking about my childhood for a bit. Nostalgia had come flooding my heart and mind as I sat in a familiar yet wondrous setting. Even still, I found myself dozing off. Guess I was too comfortable. My eyes tore open at the sound as it echoed and bounded over the dunes and into my campsite. The jitter of my heart, my sudden rapid panting, it felt as if I had awakened from a nightmare. But as I recalled, I hadn't had a nightmare. No, I recognized the sound that woke me. Coyote howls, dog-like brethren calling out under the moonlight, signaling each other some unknown information. I placed my palms on the sand, gripping it in my fingers. Squeezing my eyes shut, I reminded myself that coyotes were no danger to people these days, that a case of someone being attacked by a coyote in my tribe had never happened as long as I'd been alive. My heart rested and my breathing slowed. Nothing to worry about. I shook some sand from my hair. I didn't mean to fall asleep on the ground. Then I picked myself up and carried myself into the back of the Jeep Wrangler. The rear of my Jeep had no glass windows, so I would be very much exposed to the cold night air. But that was fine. I was overheating from the fire anyway, so I wanted to cool down some. Plus, I had a number of blankets, one of which was heated and plugged right into my Jeep's power outlet thanks to a handy adapter. Fire still crackling near the Jeep on the ground, I lay my head down onto a pillow and closed my eyes. Despite my rest having been interrupted before, and feeling more tired than I'd been in weeks, I could not go back to sleep. I must have lain there, tossing and turning, eyes remaining closed for a few hours, before I just gave up and stared up at the stars. As I wondered if I should put my headphones in and play some music from my phone, I heard a new sound from the darkness of the desert. A crying child. A single eyebrow raised, I lifted myself up and looked around. It sounded fairly close. Was some family out there, camping as well? The crying didn't stop. Instead, it drew closer, ever so slowly, as the sounds of coyotes roared around it. As the minutes ticked past and I began to grow annoyed by the unwanted chorus of the night, I made a startling discovery. Though the crying came from the same direction and slowly seemed to approach, the coyote howls were steadily converging, fusing together behind the sound of the child's cry. I stared into the darkness toward the direction of the sounds until, maybe 20 minutes later, they all had combined into one harmonious sound of layered voices. Many coyote howls, one child's cry, all coming closer by the second. My mouth had fallen wide open as I jumped from the Jeep and nearly tripped when my foot caught in a blanket. I wasn't sure why, but I felt as if I desperately needed to put out the fire and drive away in my Jeep. Something deep, something primal in me demanded that I stay no longer here. As I started to kick sand awkwardly onto the fire, to no avail, thanks to one of my feet being asleep, I found it was too late when a figure emerged from the dark at the side of one of the nearby dunes. I saw paws first, 4 paws leaving slow, deliberate tracks in the sand beneath it as it traversed down the steep mound. It seemed to be approaching the fire. I was happy that it didn't seem too interested in me. But I had never heard of wildlife approaching a person next to a fire without any caution. I thought to myself, shouldn't it be scared of the flames, scared of a human? Taking a step back, I kept a distance from the coyote as it approached my campsite at a frustratingly slow speed. It took another minute or two just to reveal the rest of itself into the light of the campfire. And when it did, I screamed and fell to the ground. My hands flew behind me, searching as I grasped at more solid ground to pull myself backward, yet all I found was a sea of loose, soft sand. The coyote's furry body ended, or rather began, at a disturbing point. Its face was not coyote at all, but human. Specifically, its face was that of a newborn baby, yet the bottom half was still the lower jaw of the coyote. The human face seemed to replace the top half of the head and snout where the nose and eyes would be. I could see its mouth open in a pant as the human face looked into the fire, the flame dancing across its tormented newborn eyes. With each step, the lower canine jaw opened and a baby's cry came dribbling out of it. Behind it, as if somehow miles back in the desert still, dozens of coyote howls accompanied the cry. The creature approached the fire at a snail's pace. Over the course of what must have been 5 minutes, it made it close enough to the flames to where it seemed satisfied. Then it sat as a dog would on its haunches, its panting slowing as the heat apparently pleased it. It had wandered a freezing desert to find solace and comfort in the heat of my fire. I soon remembered that I was still struggling to make sense of the situation from my position on the ground. I swallowed hard, forcing bile back into my stomach that desperately wanted to rise up out of fear. As I stood, causing the sands beneath me to falter, the coyote thing took notice of me. The baby's eyes looked right into mine for the very first time. I'll never forget that moment. Its lower jaw slacked open and became motionless as a childlike voice whispered from it. It said, "Mama." I left the fire ablaze, scrambling like a madman into my Jeep. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call someone from my cell phone, but I could not pull my mind away from its focus. To escape. And so I did. I drove as fast as I could in the direction of the road, coming disturbingly close to flipping the Jeep on a few occasions. When sand turned to dirt under tire, I began to cry and smile. Though I no longer lived there, I floored it back to the reservation and stayed the night with my mother, who still called the place her home. She asked what brought me to her house so late in the night. She queried me why I looked so tired and scared, and why I was covered in sand. I sat down on her couch. I spilled everything to the elderly, loving woman. After bombarding her with the most unbelievable ghost story that was my night camping, she nodded and seemed almost unfazed.
Your grandmother spoke to me of such things when she was still with us. You remember the legend of the Draggers, don't you?
Covered in a cold sweat and mouth agape, I nodded repeatedly.
Well, then you should understand this encounter entirely. Here, let me get you some tea.
She sat up and walked into the kitchen. What did that mean? I wondered. How could I understand something so out of this world? After a few seconds, she returned with a hot cup of tea and sat down again. I drank as she smirked at my still confused expression.
You still don't get it.
I shook my head.
Our people have always believed in the spirits of the land. Spirits of water, wind, fire, even of the earth and desert. When someone was taken from this world too soon, when a person passed away suddenly and in pain or torment, sometimes a part of them would stay behind. It only makes sense that you would see what you saw out there. After all, it was likely the remains of a child stolen from its mother, devoured alive by the Draggers, abandoned on this earth and forced to wander the colds of the desert night alone. And there you were, with a source of heat in the desert hell.
My mind reeled. She made my crazy story sound sane, even poetic, and it actually made sense. My fear began to wane, and a feeling of deep sadness replaced it. That creature meant no harm, I think, despite its frightening appearance. Then again, I can't help but wonder what might have transpired instead if I had successfully put the fire out, or if I had worn my headphones in the Jeep like I tried to. What would have happened if I never knew it was coming? My first encounter with the Wendigo, from Greg Gamm. My nephew and I still talk about this experience from time to time, about something we witnessed one night. We are Native American from a reservation in Canada. It happened quite a while back, maybe 14 years ago, maybe more. I can't recall when exactly, but I know it was a long time ago, when we were younger and we had the house to ourselves. While I was watching TV one night, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if I was sensing something that wasn't right. My nephew came knocking on the door and allowed himself into the house. He then said to me, "Uncle, I heard someone crying by the road. I was just walking along the driveway. Maybe they're drunk or something." Now, we did have the occasional drunk visitor, which was really annoying, and I don't drink myself. So I went outside to have a cigarette and to check this out. My nephew came along. I asked him whereabouts he heard that crying coming from, and as he pointed in the direction he had heard it, I heard it for myself. It was coming from a field that led close to my uncle's house. My uncle was a cattle farmer. Now, I didn't have a gun or a bow at the time, so I decided to grab a baseball bat from the storage room and my bear spray. I do a lot of hiking, and the area has bears. From time to time, they do come into the yard or get too close, and the dogs would chase them off, or they would bark nonstop, letting us know that they were there. I gave my nephew the bear spray and a Maglite flashlight. I mentioned it could be a lynx, as they were seen there from time to time as well. When I was going to tell him to keep an eye out for eye shine, we both saw eyes shine, and whatever those eyes belonged to, it wasn't a lynx, nor was it a normal animal. Wendigo is talked about in our culture, but many assume it is just a tale to tell around a campfire. But upon seeing this, it may just be true, because what we saw in front of us, no less than 30 feet away, sitting like a frog would, was something that was grayish or pale and thin and looked like it was starving, as its bones were noticeable through its emaciated frame and had fairly large eyes that appeared black with no pupils. More curious than afraid, and likely just plain stupid, I chuckle to myself writing this now, but I approached it. It backed up in a way that resembled a crab, going backwards into the tall grass with cattails. It was a marshy type area. I went to the spot it had been moments before, but noticed where in the water I stepped, the mud was kicked up and disturbed, but where the thing had been, it had left no signs of which direction it went. All I could see was the bottom of the pond water. I went back to where my nephew stood, and we stood back to back watching out. We didn't know if we were fine, or if we were about to get ambushed by this thing. I was still in that moment of disbelief of what I had just seen. My nephew began to shine the flashlight around, to try to find where it might have went. He stopped when he shone the light on it. He found it, and we saw it standing upright by a fence line that bordered off the farm from my dad's. It was standing sideways from us a bit, hunched over and slowly tilting its head our direction to look at us. Despite us shining the light right on it, it just vanished. We didn't even see it run or move. It was gone. We shined the light everywhere again, trying to see where we would spot it next. I then told my nephew we should get back in the house right now. We literally walked backwards together the entire way back, looking to the last area we had seen it. We stood on the veranda having a cigarette, again trying to calm our nerves and trying to make sense of what we saw. Just when I was about to say Wendigo, and I mean I got as far as saying, it's probably a we heard something screaming right by the driveway. The sound made us freeze in our spots. It was a scream we had never heard before, and mind you, we know what mountain lions and other animals sound like. But this wasn't no earthly animal. We stayed in place, once again trying to find it with the flashlight. But we couldn't. We didn't see much of anything. We saw no movement, and we even flinched when the dogs had suddenly showed up out of nowhere. But that's when we realized something. The entire time, we hadn't noticed the dogs weren't around. After all, they usually followed us when we walked around. We took the dogs coming out as a sign it had left. My nephew and I agree that we hope we never see it or hear it again. And I don't blame the dogs for hiding. If I knew what was in that field, I would have hid too. All my life. From Anonymous. All my life I've been plagued by strange and paranormal events, some terrifying and some not so much. My great-grandfather was full-blooded Native American. I vividly remember visiting him on the reservation and city. I remember sitting in his lap while playing with his braids. The women in my family are what most people call sensitive. Some of them can sense spirits. Some have had conversations, and, well, me, I've unfortunately inherited all of it. From the age of 8, I've been sensitive to many things. When my mother was married to my stepfather, he had a new home built for us in a new housing development. It was a nice ranch-style home with a roommate floor plan. Although the house was brand new, I still was terrified and even outright refused to sleep in my room. Whenever I did, terrifying things would happen. One night, while being forced to sleep in my room by my mother, who was tired of me sleeping in their living room, I was on the verge of falling asleep when I was jolted awake by what any 8-year-old would call a terrifying event. I awoke with my body halfway off the bottom of my bed, and my covers on the floor at the bottom of the bed. I had been snatched at my ankle from the top of my bed and almost completely pulled off the bed by an unseen force. Well, that wasn't even the half of it. Before my parents were divorced, that room gave me more nightmares than I could possibly count. Not only having physical interactions with things that I couldn't see, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see pale faces staring at me from the wall. Literally half of a see-through human form protruding from my wall silently watching me. It scared the living daylights out of me. When I was 13, the most terrifying event up to that point happened. The pretense to this event was a few days before the big event happened. I was napping on the couch in the living room when I felt someone slap me. Now, this wasn't a slight slap. There was force behind it. It felt as if someone slapped me with all their might, and when my eyes snapped open, I sat up, crying, and yet there was no one around. Fast forward a few days, my mother and I had gotten into an argument. I don't remember what the argument was about. Probably the normal things young girls and mothers argue about. But I stormed off to my room. Now, I'm a very even-tempered girl at that age. Not much made me angry. But I was unusually angry then. Like I could snap someone's neck angry. I remember sitting on my bed, cursing my mother in my head. I felt a force literally enter my body, and my arms went stiff. My head snapped down. I began to growl. This growl was not something I could reproduce even if I tried. It was a guttural growl that one would hear from an angry, rabid dog. I was terrified, but I had control over my thoughts, but not my body. So I could not open my mouth to yell out for help. I remember wanting to scream for help, but I couldn't. I remember my legs kept swinging off the bed as if my body was trying to get up. The only thought that was racing through my head was if I get up, I'm going to seriously hurt my mother. I concentrated as hard as I could. I forced my mouth open to scream, "Mom!" That was all I could get out before my mouth snapped back shut and the growling continued. My mother, who's religious, made it to my room in seconds to see me on the bed growling, and she began to pray. I don't remember much. The only thing I remember is the beginning of her prayer and going into convulsions. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but when I came to, I felt as if all my energy had drained and I could sleep for days. That was just the beginning of what has been a life of extremely terrifying events. I would have never been here. From Anonymous. If you ever meet my mom, she can be stuck up. Sometimes it's embarrassing, but I'm glad she's like that. If she wasn't, I would have never been here. Back then, around the 1980s, my mother was on her own, living in Phoenix. She would frequently go back to the Navajo reservation in New Mexico because her dad, my grandfather, lived there. One night on her way back to my grandfather's, she stopped at a truck stop in Camp Verde. As she got out of her truck, she was walking into the store. She saw a guy, and in her words, she said he was handsome. As she got closer to him, he spoke to her, saying, "Hey, I need a ride to New Mexico. Can you give me a ride?" My mother ignored him and made a disgusted sound as she walked by him. Before she went inside, she took one more look back and saw another car coming, so she blew it off. She did her business and came back outside. The man was gone, and so was that other car. She shook it off and went back to my grandfather's. In the morning, she and my grandfather were watching the news. She literally spit out her coffee and yelled, "That was him! He tried asking me for a ride!" My grandfather trembled at the realization of what that meant. The newscast on the TV stated, "Breaking news. Serial killer Ted Bundy has been seen in numerous places around Arizona." My Grandpa's Ghost. From Little Rez Kid. This story takes place on the Blackfoot Reservation in Montana. My dad would often tell this story to me. It's not terribly scary, but maybe a little eerie. My dad's grandpa, Bumps, died when my dad was about 11 or 12. They owned a saddle shop and would make saddles for people. After my dad's grandpa died, if you sat on the porch late at night, you would be able to hear the noise of a hammer striking something coming from the saddle shop. My dad, my two uncles, and my grandma and grandpa both think it's my great-grandpa Bumps.